How does one make a game? It's a complicated process. In film, you have pre-production where you design the ideas and plan it out. Then comes the production phase where you actually shoot the film with actors and cameras. Finally is post-production, where all those plans and footage are compiled into a video. Games are not quite like that, at least indie games aren't. Indie in this case is short for independent, as in there's no big company like Nintendo funding it. There's plenty of important games in video game history that are indie, games like Hotline Miami, Undertale, and even Minecraft. These are passionate games made by passionate people who just decided to make games. But you can't just make a game. You may not have an organized process like the modes of production in film, but that's not because there is no process, just that the process in question is far less clean. You go from designing, to modeling, to programming, to planning, to remodeling, to redesigning, to researching, and it goes on. But there is always a starting point, and that is, of course, the idea. Now, there is a sort of divide in how you want to think about video game design. There is the design, that is the aesthetics, and there is the gameplay, that is how you play it. And this idea that you have, it can either be a design for some sort of world, a setting that you are enthralled by, one that you want to make. Or it can be a gameplay idea, a thought of this would be fun to do, and you can design your design around that. Let's take this game I've been working on, For the Love of Craft. If you couldn't tell by the title, it's Lovecraft themed, but also lighthearted and at least attempts to be somewhat humorous. I decided to start with the aesthetic, the design. I thought that it may be interesting that, in a world full of Lovecraftian monsters, an extermination company would be a welcome business. Next, I had to decide my style of gameplay.
And the idea, the crystal core of the game started to form, Here's a bunch of games I like, Cuphead being a big one, 90s arcade bosses. I've always liked boss rush games, right? I thought this would be interesting for Lovecraft, where you show up, you kill a monster, and you're done. A big monster, none of them are easy, and then you're done.
So, we have the basic theme, in this case an exterminator who fights Lovecraftian horrors, and we have the gameplay plan, a side perspective shooter. From here, you can either begin the programming or you can start with the designing. It doesn't really matter which one you start with, you'll be going back to both eventually. I decided to design first, for Lovecraft was originally a 2D game, but I decided I wanted to make it 3D.
But there was something about it that just wasn't clicking. I think the 2D element was hindering me. I'm not intimately familiar with a lot of 2D techniques like shading that make it really hard to make something that looks, good. Which is saying nothing of the fact that most of these, elements of 2D animation are much more static. You can tween and you can squash and stretch to a degree. In 3D, you can do it much more naturally without as much, intimate knowledge with how anatomy works. Other things like that, how physics works.
Usually for your design, the best place to start is with your protagonist. After all, the player is going to see them for the whole game. Meet Theobald, or Theo for short. Named after Lovecraft's pseudonym, Uncle Theobald, here is For the Love of Craft's protagonist. So how do we make a Theobald? Here is where some intersectionality of media production begins to begin. There are three primary components that I've found useful when it comes to designing it for video game characters: key points of focus, silhouettes, and color composition. Characters should say something about themselves without a single line of dialogue. This is the point of key points. My priority with Theo is to make it clear that he's just an exterminator, not a super bounty hunter, just a guy doing his job. A mechanic's jumpsuit seemed like the way to go. I also wanted him to be a little ominous, and so completed the look with gloves, boots, and a gas mask. His gun is also a normal-looking pistol to emphasize the normalcy of his job, a Luger in fact, to complement the World War I style mask. With a mask, however, he can't express himself very easily, so I gave him a hat as well, one that can bounce around and stuff. The silhouette describes, well, the silhouette of the character. It should be distinct, though how distinct depends on what style you're going for. Theobald doesn't seem to stand out all too much, but the majority of other characters he'll be around are non-humanoid, so he'll actually be the odd one out. His mask and hat also give him a little bit more defined outline, one that most people wouldn't quite have. This is one of those times where the topics merge with one another, with the design and desires for the gas mask and hat overlap with the need for a unique silhouette. Color composition is how the colors all work together. To boost the spookiness of the mask, gloves, and boots, they're all dark black with dark gray highlights. The jumpsuit then should contrast strongly, so it should be colorful. Too colorful and it's garish. This blue is a nice color, and it's reminiscent of the mechanic look I'm wanting him to have. Finally, his eyes should really pop, so using this bright amber color should be good in moderation. The front of his hat's also white, just to help this symbol stand out more as well. I don't want his lower body to just be an unbroken single color though, that's a little ugly. So I broke it up with some complementary knee pads and a belt. All of them match the other blacks on his body. Now, let's apply these principles to our boss, Kazuza.
So, Kazuza actually designing her. She was vaguely chess themed, which gave me a starting point. In character design, you want to emphasize things. Well, she has this slender body, two massive sides, and a mouth in her mouth. And that's what needed to be emphasized. She slashes and she bites. That's most of her attacks. She also spits through her mouth, you know.
First, the key points of focus are her arms, mouth, and a crown for that good old chess theme. All of these components are core characteristics of her silhouette, and each have a different color, with her crown a bronze color and her teeth and sides with a white gleam. Her crown is, on closer inspection, a busted pipe, making her fit better in the sewers where she lurks. She's also very asymmetrical, emphasized with the crown, her teeth, and her scattered eyes. Again, her eyes are a nice color to look at that contrasts strongly with her body. Her body also gleams, something that you can't see until she gets into the game engine. This will help contrast with other slime that I added in later on. After all, the designing is unfortunately the skill floor. In order to implement these ideas, aesthetic or programming, you have to either be familiar with the implementation programs or you have to be willing to learn them. Blender is a great tool for character modeling, 3D or 2D, and is what I use for modeling Theo. Unity is also my game engine of choice. The programming language that it uses is C#.
Is this really all they had to worry about? Boys, movies, deciding which shirt goes with which skirt?
You should be wary of your abilities. Making something that looks like The Last of Us is virtually impossible for an indie dev, and even making something that looks like Darkest Dungeon will be a challenge if you don't have a relatively large team or budget. I decided to go for a classic look, reminiscent of games like Crash Bandicoot or Chibi Robo. Modeling is a whole nother beast, but one with many accessible tutorials and guides. I cannot begin to count how many guides I use for this entire process. Long story short, it's a lot of very tedious work. Next is importing into the game engine. Again, I made use of plenty of guides and tutorials. Once you get your character in, it's a good idea to make a little playground to program in your movement and playtest the basics. After that is just, well, moving forward. I tested out some basic AI and then made the sewers as an arena using the same design principles as before. Key points of focus, silhouette, and color composition. Then I modeled Kazuza and got to work programming her. Here's where the mechanics begin to really matter. The mechanics of a game dictate how the player plays. The original AI for Kazuza just had her randomly bite, slash, and sink. Players then would just stand far away and shoot at her with no real reason to worry. Instead, I made her AI more intelligent. She would now slash and move herself anytime the player was far away. When the player was too close, she'd do a fast bite. Now the player wants to keep her on screen to make sure she can't hit them, but not too close. Also, now she does her sing attack when she's too close to the wall or when she needs to turn around. As you're finishing up the basics, don't forget your UI or user interface, stuff like menus. I want it to be reminiscent of old, cheap advertisements, again taking inspiration from the World War vibes of Theo and the 1920s that Lovecraft is so often associated with. It's not exact, but it gives the impression. Don't forget the camera as well, it can emote just as much as the character can. The overlap between cinematography for film and games is very strong. Once you have the basics down, it's time to playtest with a wider
I mean,
audience.
the gameplay is fine. The walk speed's good. The bullet speed, I think it could be a little faster, but it works pretty well.
I had a few of my friends playtest For the Love of Craft, and they had some strongly worded criticisms. And now I'm redesigning and re-implementing quite a few things. After I finish those, the demo for the Love of Craft will be available at cspidereyes.itch.io, probably next month. And those are the basics of starting to make a game. It's exhausting, requiring hours and hours of work and consideration. But
I gained not only an appreciation for the subject of game design, but a love of it. I find myself excited to work on For the Love of Craft, you know? I find myself more and more exhilarated to think about the design behind these things, you know? I was always interested in game design, of course, but now that I'm doing it more proper, you know, it's exciting. It's an exciting subject. You know, maybe my dreams of being a game developer are not quite so scratchy yet.